In March of 2017, a former law enforcement detective led a forensic research team into the forests of Northern California and came back with something that does not fit inside any scientific category on Earth. What they documented over 4 days in the Hoopa Valley changed the investigation permanently. DNA that matches nothing in any database, footprints with biological ridge patterns, a handprint with an opposable thumb, and 4 minutes of footage. Subscribe and stay with us because this one is different. David Paulides spent nearly 2 decades doing work that most investigators avoid entirely. Before he became known for his Missing 411 research, he served in law enforcement long enough to understand the difference between a credible report and a story built around what someone wanted to believe. He was a former detective. He dealt in physical evidence, documented timelines, and corroborated witness accounts. He had watched too many Bigfoot reports fall apart the moment someone pressed for specifics. Grainy footage that dissolved under enhancement into a man in a jacket. Footprints carved from wood with no dermal detail. Eyewitness accounts that contradicted themselves within the first 10 minutes of questioning. He had seen all of it, and he had walked away from most of it. What changed in February of 2017 was not a sighting report. It was a phone call from the Hoopa Valley Reservation in Northern California. The tribal elders who reached out to Paulides were not interested in publicity. They were not looking for a television crew or a documentary team. They had watched enough outside investigators come through their territory with cameras and notepads and leave without understanding anything about what they had actually seen. What the elders communicated to Paulides was specific and measured. Something large and unknown had been actively occupying a remote section of their land. The signs of its presence were not new. The Hupa people had maintained detailed accounts of encounters with what they called massive, intelligent forest beings for centuries. They had a name for them. They had behavioral descriptions that had been passed down through generations with a consistency that did not resemble mythology. It resembled documentation. The elders were not alarmed by the presence of these beings in the way an outsider might expect. They were concerned about something shifting. The frequency of signs had increased. The physical evidence being left behind was closer to inhabited areas than it had been in living memory. They wanted someone with a forensic background to document what was on their land before the window closed. Tribal Ranger McCovey had captured something on a trail camera and refused to discuss what it showed over the phone. That refusal was the detail that convinced Paulides to make the trip. A man who had seen something genuinely unexplained and chose not to describe it remotely was either deeply unsettled or deeply certain that what he had was real. Either answer was worth the drive. Paulides assembled a research team that included forensic specialists and videographers, and arrived at the Hoopa Valley Reservation on March 12th of 2017. Nobody on that team fully understood what they were walking into. The drive into the remote section of the reservation where the elders had directed them began on a narrow dirt road that wound through increasingly dense ancient forest. Within the first mile, the canopy closed overhead and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The sound of the outside world fell away. What replaced it was creek water moving over stone somewhere below the road and occasional branch breaks coming from the slope above them, heavy enough to carry through the trees, irregular enough to suggest something that was not wind and not falling timber. The team had brought standard field equipment, forensic casting materials, evidence collection kits, GPS units, high-resolution cameras, and audio recording gear capable of capturing frequencies below the threshold of normal human hearing. They had protocol. They had documentation procedures designed to withstand scientific peer review. What they did not have was any reference point for what they were about to find because nothing in any existing database matched it. Within the first hour of reaching the survey area near a creek drainage deep in the valley, forensic technician Webb identified the beginning of a trackway in the soft earth along the bank. The prints were arranged in a perfect bipedal sequence, alternating left and right, spaced at intervals consistent with a creature moving at a deliberate walking pace. The first measurement stopped everything: 18.5 inches in length, 8.5 inches in width. Those dimensions placed the creature outside the size range of every known North American animal. A grizzly bear moving on its hind legs will occasionally leave a large impression, but the shape is wrong, the toe distribution is wrong, the proportions cannot be made to fit. These prints were not bear. They were not human. They were something that walked upright on 2 legs with a foot built for weight distribution across a frame that no one on the team had encountered before. The stride pattern itself told part of the story. The distance between each impression indicated a leg length and a hip structure designed for covering ground efficiently over rough terrain, the kind of forest floor where loose rock and root systems and uneven soil would buckle a human ankle. Whatever left these prints moved through that terrain without breaking its stride. Webb and the team documented 47 individual prints stretching 127 feet feet along the creek bank before the trackway moved off the soft ground and became impossible to follow. They had been on site for less than 60 minutes. The evidence collection had barely begun. The size of the prints was what stopped the team initially. It would not have been enough on its own. Oversized footprints have been produced by hoaxers using carved wooden stamps and prosthetic feet for as long as Bigfoot investigations have existed. Size alone proves nothing. What Paulides and Webb identified in the preserved mud of the creek bank was something that a wooden stamp cannot replicate under any circumstances. Dermal ridges. The prints contained the fine biological ridge patterns that form on primate hands and feet during fetal development. On human skin, these patterns are what produce fingerprints and the equivalent ridge systems on the soles of the feet. They form in the womb from the mechanical interaction between the developing skin layers and the fluid environment surrounding the fetus. They are unique to each individual, and they are an expression of biology at a level of detail that no manufactured reproduction can authentically capture. A carved wooden stamp pressed into mud produces a smooth impression. A rubber prosthetic produces a smooth impression. Neither one produces the microscopic ridge patterns visible in these prints, because those patterns are not surface features that can be applied to an object and transferred. They are the product of living tissue pressing against a medium capable of preserving that level of detail, and the mud along that creek bank was exactly soft enough and exactly dense enough to hold it. Webb photographed every impression that contained visible ridge detail. Multiple prints showed the patterns clearly enough for analysis. The toe structure visible in the impressions revealed additional information. The toes showed a spread pattern indicating gripping capability, the ability to flex and grip uneven surfaces the way a foot adapted for climbing and traversing loose terrain would need to. The overall structure was not human, and it was not consistent with any cataloged primate. It suggested a foot evolved along a separate pathway, optimized for environments where the ground is never entirely flat and where maintaining balance across shifting surfaces is a daily survival requirement. The documentation of the trackway took hours. Every print was photographed with scale references from multiple angles. GPS coordinates were recorded for each impression. Plaster casts were created for the clearest examples. By the time the team completed the trackway documentation, they had a physical evidence record of a creature that walked upright, left biological tissue patterns in its impressions, and possessed a foot structure adapted for the specific terrain of that valley. They had not yet found the shelter. Approximately 200 yards upstream from where the trackway ended, Tribal Ranger McCovey led the team to a structure in the forest that stopped their movement the moment they entered the clearing around it. Paulides later described the first impression as disorienting, not because the structure was elaborate, but because the scale of deliberate construction was impossible to dismiss once you were standing in front of it. The shelter measured 9 feet in diameter. It had been formed by breaking and weaving branches pulled from the surrounding trees into a dome configuration that provided both overhead coverage and lateral concealment from the surrounding forest. The breaks in the branches were not random. They did not look like wind damage or the result of an animal pushing through dense growth. Each break point showed deliberate twisting, the kind of force applied by something that understood how to snap a green branch cleanly rather than tear it. The breaks had been made at heights ranging from 8 to 10 feet above the ground, consistently throughout the entire structure. Nothing capable of reaching those heights while simultaneously applying the directional torque needed to produce those clean breaks existed in any known North American wildlife catalog. Inside the structure, compressed vegetation formed a central bedding area. The plant material had been arranged in layers and showed evidence of repeated use over an extended period, meaning this was not a single night stopover. Something had returned to this location consistently enough to compact the vegetation in the center, while maintaining the integrity of the surrounding shelter walls. The site selection itself was significant. The structure was positioned with its open side oriented away from the prevailing wind direction for that drainage. Its back faced a natural rise in the terrain that blocked approach from the uphill slope. It sat 30 yards from the creek, close enough for water access without being so close that rising water or creek noise would compromise the occupant's awareness of approaching movement. Every element of its placement reflected an understanding of the environment that went beyond instinct. Instinct produces burrows and dens and resting spots under fallen logs. This was something that had assessed a location, identified its advantages, and then modified the surrounding materials to create a structure optimized for shelter, concealment, and situational awareness simultaneously. Dr. Chen collected 37 individual hair samples from the broken branches throughout the shelter. Several specimens retained follicles, intact biological material capable of producing DNA. They bagged and labeled every sample under the same forensic protocols used in criminal investigations. Nobody said what they were all thinking. They had just documented a structure built by something that was not supposed to exist. On the morning of March 14, 2017, while the team was surveying a second suspected nesting site approximately 1.3 miles from the original trackway location, Dr. Chen moved toward a small seep spring at the edge of the survey area. The ground around the spring was saturated and soft. The mist from the night had not fully lifted, and the air in the drainage was cold and still. She was moving carefully, picking her way along a game trail where the surface was most compressed, when she almost stepped on it, pressed into the mud beside the spring, as though whatever made it had leaned down to drink from the water source was a partial handprint. The edges were still sharp. The water from the seep was just beginning to seep into the deepest section of the palm impression. This had been made within hours, possibly less. The print measured approximately 11 inches from the tip of the thumb to the opposite edge of the handspan. 5 distinct digits were visible in the gray mud, clearly separated, clearly defined in the individual tip impressions. And there, on the medial side of the print, fully preserved in the saturated earth, was an opposable thumb. It was thick, it was powerful, and it was set at an angle that indicated full rotation capability. An opposable thumb is not a feature that appears in the anatomy of bears, mountain lions, elk, or any other large North American animal. It is a primate characteristic. It is the feature that enables grip around irregular objects, fine manipulation of materials, and tool use. The thumb impression in that mud indicated a creature with the manual dexterity to grip, to manipulate, to construct, and potentially to use tools with precision, Chen called out once quietly. When the team reached her position, nobody spoke for several seconds. Webb knelt beside the print and studied it. He then held his own hand above the impression. His entire palm fit inside the area of the thumb pad alone. The team spent the next several hours documenting the handprint with the same forensic protocols they had applied to everything else. Over 400 photographs were taken with GPS metadata embedded in every image. Multiple plaster casts were created. Additional hair samples were collected from vegetation within 10 meters of the spring. By mid-morning, they had assembled what Paulides would later describe as the most comprehensive collection of physical evidence ever documented in the history of this field. They did not yet know that something had been watching them work for the past hour from the tree line above. Videographer Tom Richards had been working the handprint site for most of the morning, adjusting camera positions and documenting the evidence collection from multiple angles when he caught movement in his peripheral vision. It came from the slope above their position, approximately 100 yards uphill into the dense timber, a shadow shifting between the trunks in a way that was inconsistent with wind or the movement of light through the canopy. Richards did not react. 20 years of field videography had produced a specific discipline in him, the knowledge that sudden movement and direct attention will end a shot before it begins. He kept his body oriented toward his equipment, shifted the telephoto lens 2 degrees to the right with one deliberate hand, and pressed record with the other. His shoulders stayed loose. His posture did not change. To anyone watching him, he was doing exactly what he had been doing all morning. Between the trunks of 2 massive Douglas firs, standing in the shadow line where the mist had not yet burned off, something was present that should not have been there. It was large in a way that registered before any specific detail became clear. Broad across the shoulders, covered in dark hair uniform in color and texture, standing fully upright on 2 legs without any of the forward lean or weight shift that characterizes a human attempting to move through dense forest. It was not moving through, it was stationary. It was positioned deliberately behind natural concealment, with its head angled downhill toward the team's work area. It was watching them. Richards controlled his breathing and held the shot. The telephoto brought the figure into clearer definition. The proportions were wrong for a human in ways that accumulated the longer he looked. The shoulders were too wide relative to the hips. The arms hung past the knee line, a proportion that in human anatomy indicates a skeletal structure organized differently at the torso and upper limb. The neck column was extraordinary in its thickness, with no visible separation between the trapezius muscles and the base of the skull. The creature held its position for 90 seconds without moving. Then Paulides shifted his stance below and glanced uphill. The response was immediate and total. Every part of the creature's body locked into absolute stillness simultaneously. Not the flinch of a startled animal, not the tensing of a body preparing to flee. A controlled and complete cessation of movement that held for as long as Paulides' gaze moved across that section of tree line. It understood that motion draws the human eye. It understood that stillness against a dark background renders even a massive body nearly invisible. And it waited until Paulides looked back down at the evidence site before it moved again. For 4 minutes, the creature held its position in the timber above the team's work area, and during those 4 minutes it demonstrated a behavioral pattern that Richards was still capturing on the telephoto lens. Every time a member of the team glanced uphill, the the creature froze. Every time attention returned to the evidence collection below, it repositioned. The repositioning was not random. Each new position it selected offered a clearer observation angle on what the team was doing, while simultaneously reducing the creature's own visual profile by placing more solid timber between itself and the nearest set of human eyes. It was not wandering. It was not foraging. It was managing its own concealment in real time, adapting to the team's movement patterns with a situational awareness that Paulides, the former detective, described later as counter-surveillance. The term is not casual. Counter-surveillance is a specific behavior pattern in which a subject actively monitors an observer while taking deliberate steps to avoid detection. It requires an understanding of how the observer's attention operates, where it is likely to focus, how long it typically holds on a given point, and what positions offer the best combination of information gathering and self-concealment. The creature executed this with a fluency that indicated extensive experience. It had done this before, possibly hundreds of times over a lifespan spent in forests shared with humans who were looking for it. It had learned where human eyes track. It had learned how long human attention holds on a given sector before moving. It had learned the specific geometry of timber shadow and trunk width needed to render its mass invisible at 100 yards. Richards held the shot until the creature finally moved deeper into the timber and disappeared between the trees with a single fluid step that produced almost no sound. He lowered the camera, walked to Paulides, and said 2 words. "Check this." Frame-by-frame analysis conducted after the team returned confirmed what Richards had captured in full. The creature's shoulder width, arm length, and overall proportions were consistent across multiple frames with the measurements derived from the footprints and handprint. Its bipedal locomotion matched the gait pattern indicated by the trackway along the creek bank. The muscle mass visible through its hair covering aligned with the force required to produce the clean branch breaks documented in the nest structure. Every piece of physical evidence the team had collected over 3 days pointed to a single source, and the audio track beneath the footage captured something that analysis would later identify as structured low-frequency vocalizations with harmonic layering that no known animal and no human vocal anatomy can produce. Every hair sample and biological specimen collected over the 4-day investigation was shipped to independent laboratories under blind submission protocols. The labs were not told what they were analyzing or where the material had originated. Every major university that identified the connection to cryptozoological research declined to conduct the analysis. A private forensic genetics laboratory ultimately agreed. The results arrived in May of 2017, and they produced a finding that neither laboratory anticipated when they began the process. The DNA extracted from the hair samples and biological material collected at the nest sites showed clear primate markers consistent with the great ape family. The sequences did not match human contamination. They did not match gorilla, chimpanzee, orangutan, or any other cataloged primate species. They did not match any entry in the GenBank database, a repository containing over 34 trillion base pairs of genetic information from every organism science has formally documented on Earth. The sequences suggested an evolutionary branch that had diverged from the human line millions of years ago and developed along a separate pathway, one that produced adaptations specific to forest environments in North America. Critics argued contamination. Paulides had anticipated the objection. Even in a worst-case contamination scenario, human contact with the samples would introduce known human sequences onto the maternal and paternal lines. What cannot be produced through contamination is a genetic signature that matches nothing in any existing database. A second independent laboratory using different equipment and different procedures verified the results. The findings were consistent across both analyses. Whatever left those prints and built those shelters and watched that team from the timber above them carried DNA from a lineage that science has never formally cataloged. The plaster casts were labeled and stored. The photographs were archived with their GPS metadata intact. The laboratory reports were filed. The footage was backed up across multiple drives, and still none of it fully accounts for what happened on the morning of March 14th in that creek drainage in the Hoopa Valley when something pressed its hand into the mud beside a spring and then stood in the timber above a forensic team and watched them cast the impression. It did not run. It did not charge. It watched with a patience that investigators who have spent careers studying animal behavior do not have a behavioral category for, because it is not animal behavior. It is the behavior of a subject that understands what is being done, why it is being done, and what the outcome of that documentation means for itself. Freedom of Information requests filed after the investigation revealed that government agencies had documented similar encounters in remote areas across North America without making those records public. Rangers had redirected questions. Military personnel in affected areas had been debriefed and instructed not to discuss what they had seen. The same pattern appeared across every case. These beings understood human technology. They avoided trail cameras with a consistency that exceeded chance. They recognized when they were being tracked, and they adjusted accordingly. The Hoopa people had known this for centuries. Their name for these beings, their behavioral descriptions, their accounts of constructed shelters and maintained territories matched what Paulides documented in March of 2017 down to the specific details. When the team loaded their vehicles and drove out along that dirt road through the closing canopy, the creature was still in the valley. It was still there when they crossed the reservation boundary. It is probably still there now.